Starting with the need to build a shelter that protects people from nature and its external influences, we are surrounded by design, space, and architecture almost everywhere in our environment today. Developments from the simplest building forms to evolving traditions that manifested themselves in regional buildings to today's international architecture play an important role. Regional buildings are therefore not only the mere geographical classification of a building or construction, but defines a process around its creation and in its local context. These conditions are the climate, as well as the building materials which can be taken from the immediate surrounding. In addition, this process is characterized by sociological aspects such as cultural, social, and historical developments. As a result of industrialization, the architecture of the new modernism was rationalized and functionally planned due to mass production and began to detach and distance itself from traditions. But at the same time, the Weißenhof-Siedlung received a great deal of criticism, especially from the right-wing political orientation, for breaking away from the traditional. The Kochenhof-Siedlung was supposed to be the answer and propagate traditional and regional building. Words such as landscape typical, house building, vernacular, homeland, regional, or even identity were reinterpreted and used for propaganda purposes by the Nazi regime. Because of this misuse, these terms often remain negatively afflicted after such events. Regional building forms are characterized by the fact that in them homeland and identity come to a cultural expression both in physical and psychological form. Those characteristics are effected from the outside and create an architecture or a form of construction that appears regional and thus offers the build the possibility to enter a dialectic process. Soglio is a small village in the Alpine region of the canton of Graubünden in Switzerland. The architect Armando Ruinelli converted an unused stable in the village center into a residential house. With very small and considerate interventions and the use of local materials, the architect creates a modern and regionally related architecture. The shown regional buildings are less to be put into the context of today's parameters. More, these buildings reflect the return to the elemental in architecture. While today's regional buildings in Europe are less concerned with the question of functionality, but mainly with its reinterpretation, the question of identity and its effect on modern society and the political discourse. Regional building always involves a return to the elemental and the local sources. Regional building is always closely connected with the prevailing of both social and societal conditions. Regional building always requires the duality of regional influences as well as the confrontation with universal developments and is clearly distinguished from populism and nostalgic historicism. Kenneth Frampton states, regional building can only develop identity and meaning in a clearly defined space. Regional building is always the confrontation with and the embedding of the building in the local characteristics and history, as well as the prevailing environmental conditions. The Uckermark is a historic rural landscape in the northeast of Germany. In its context, the Berlin architect Thomas Kröger realized a workhouse that refers in its typology to existing settlement houses from the post-war period, and in its choice of materials incorporates locally used materials into its design. For the architect, the representatives of critical regionalism such as Alvar Aalto, Luigi Snozzi, Alvaro Siza, and Jon Utzon are exemplary for the relocalization of modernism and stand as a counter-movement to the international style with Mies van der Rohe as its most important representative. Dorte Mantrup asks, how do we make the new and the old go together? And how do we give this rather anonymous building a character that speaks about the place we're at? The answer she gives with her What and See Center is, it has to be a way of developing the local tradition to a contemporary architecture. The process of conquest and colonization gave unity to the regional architecture of Latin America, as well as the tropical climate and materials. In the particular case of Cuba, it was marked by 3 stages, the colonial, the neo-colonial, and the revolutionary stages. In these 3 stages, Cuban architecture went through various styles in different periods. Fortress-like constructions dominated the 16th century, Hispanic mutia influences the 17th century, Baroque architecture predominated the 18th, and neoclassical architecture the 19th century. And the 20th century was defined by eclectic designs. It would be the 20th century that would have the most changes. In the 40s, the Art Deco, the modern movement took over. In the 50s, prefabrication came up in the 70s and was followed by postmodernism. At the transition from 20th to 21st century, an important architecture without any national and regional identity is present. Cuban architecture presents potentials in its inherited architecture and in the new generations of architects, disadvantages in current economic problems and in housing deficit, viability in local materials and resources, and adaptations to social changes and economic needs. The transfer potential of Cuban architecture in the current context is lost due to the needs that the country faces. Among these risks are a lack of knowledge concerning rehabilitation of property, a lack of resources for its adequate conservation, and the forced adapt of old buildings to current technologies and needs without taking their heritage value into account.